Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 525th New Social Environment. I'm Nick, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation, Defamiliarizations in Chinese Visual Cultures and Aesthetics, featuring Jia, Drew Hammond, and Paul Gladston. We're thrilled to welcome poet Jennifer S Cheng here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication art, music, dance, film, theater, and literature, along with thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we do need your support. Your contribution will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and operations here at the Rail. Please check the chat in a moment for more information and links to donate. But now to introduce today's guests and host. Born in Beijing, Jia has worked as an architect, magazine editor, and curator of exhibitions in China after her early work was exhibited at the Shanghai Biennale of 2002. Since moving her studio to Berlin in 2009, her artwork has become the subject of 20 publications and has been exhibited in numerous museum exhibitions in Europe and the US. Drew Hammond is an award-winning critic and curator based in Berlin. He is a graduate of the Department of East Asian Languages at Columbia University, specializing in Neo-Confucian thought under Wing-tsit Chan. His, apologies for my pronunciation, his recent publications include James Hayward, The Non-Secular Paintings, St. John's Art Center, Collegeville, Minnesota in 2019. And last but certainly not least, critical theorist and cultural historian Paul Gladston is the inaugural Judith Neilson Professor, Chair of Contemporary Art at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. He is the inaugural co-editor of the series Contemporary East Asian Visual Cultures, Societies, and Politics, and was founding principal editor of the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. And with that, Paul, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Nick. First thing I'd like to say is that I'm on unceded, speaking from unceded Gadigal land in what is now Sydney. Thanks again, Nick, for hosting, and thanks to your colleagues for being here in support. It's great to be back. As some viewers to tonight's panel may know, this is in the kind of second title, second theme in a short series related to Chinese visual cultures and aesthetics. And the first two panels, we had a kind of comeback panel on the first one, was about abstractions. This one is about defamiliarizations. And the third one, which will be next month, is about realisms. And I guess what everybody will recognize is that we're employing titles that normally have a relationship to the idea of a progressive, avant-garde, modernist, postmodernist, contemporary art in a Euro-American and international context. And what we're doing here really is upholding these ideas of abstraction, defamiliarization, and realism, upholding them in relation to Chinese visual cultures and aesthetics, to see to what extent those ideas are applicable. And what we've already found with abstractions is that, yes, they do have a relevance to Chinese art, Chinese visual culture, but it's not an exact relevance. There's a slippage, and indeed there are some kind of issues of timing where perhaps some ideas of abstraction in, well, certainly some ideas of abstraction in Chinese visual culture precede those which we're familiar with in Western or Euro-American culture. So Nick, if I can just have the slides up. I'm just going to speak for about, hopefully, 7 or 10 minutes, just as a preamble. Right, we're going to move to, yeah, it's my slides first, it's okay. We're going to come to the important stuff next. That's it. Okay, that's great. If you could just go to the second slide, please, Nick. Just so that everybody's clear, I'm using defamiliarizations here as a kind of catch-all, imperfect catch-all term. And it's being used to refer to a whole kind of lexicon of techniques and ideas that we're very familiar with in relation to our understanding of progressive art since the late 19th or certainly the early 20th century. So you can see there, I've given a kind of a list which doesn't have a fixed ending of various techniques that we usually associate and which in fact we tend to see as defining progressive art, certainly within Euro-American, but actually even within international context. I think the important thing here is that there have been changing interpretations of what those techniques mean. So collage montage or one or the other, collage and or montage, were certainly seen as ways of presenting familiar things in unfamiliar ways. They've been given a Marxian spin as a kind of dialectical synthetic reworking of the everyday. More recently, deconstruction of texts, deconstruction proliferations of meaning, even in a Deleuzian way. And perhaps more recently, the use of these techniques in an ostensibly international way, where everybody's, or transcultural way, where contemporary art across the globe can be seen to employ similar techniques of this sort, but perhaps in different ways. You know, we live in a time of contemporaneity where everything's intensely interconnected, but as recent events have shown, not everybody's reading from the same page. Next slide, please, Nick. Yeah, I'm just going to go through a few examples that we're all, are pretty familiar with, and perhaps some examples that we're not so familiar with as to how defamiliarization has been used, both within Euro-American context and internationally. So next slide after that. Well, this is something I think we readily understand, the emergence of collage montage with Picasso, taking of ordinary objects and putting them into new contexts, such as the robe and the oilcloth chair caning. And of course, the thing that tends to be seen as seminal to contemporary art and modernist art, and certainly postmodernist art before it, is Duchamp's use of the ready-made. These are very familiar defamiliarizations, if you forgive the pun. Next slide. I think it's important to acknowledge that the kind of techniques that we associate with the Euro-American avant-gardes in the early 20th century were very quickly being used elsewhere. Here's a couple of examples. Akada Tasur, a Japanese example of things that we might think of as part of European Dada, but also Lang Jingshan, photographer, Chinese photographer working in the 20s, 30s, who's an early exponent of photo montage. When we look at Lang's work, we don't necessarily see the kinds of disjunctive working that we usually associate with avant-garde work, but nevertheless, we have defamiliarization techniques, which I think we may discuss as we go along as having a relationship to a long-standing Chinese cultural habitus. Next slide, Nick. Well, again, we're familiar with this. Jasper John's defamiliarization of the American flag, open to interpretation as a resistance to the McCarthyism of the 1950s, and also at the time, his inability to be out as a gay artist. There's a big exhibition at two places, I think, in the US at the moment of John's work, and I was reading an article about it where they're using the theme of reflection as one that runs through all of John's work as a kind of another species of defamiliarization. Well, here's the obvious example, the reflection of the American flag. Piero Manzoni doesn't need much of an introduction. Next slide, please. This runs through conceptualism. Obviously, Michael Craig Martin doing the Duchampian thing, putting a glass of water on a glass shelf as a kind of transubstantiation of an oak tree. Similar thing with Joseph Kossuth, relating back to Platonic aesthetics. Next slide, please. And it goes on, of course. We can go from the kind of semiotic feminist art of the mid-70s, use of video, the kind of neo-modernism, if you like, or neo-conservative postmodernism of Schnabel, all of which are defamiliarizing in one way or another. And the next slide, please. Post-conceptual art. The Yinka Shonibara is an interesting one. I guess everybody here will be familiar with James's painting of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews in one context or another, the 18th century painting, which shows Mr. and Mrs. Andrews being the surveyors of their own land as part of an English squirearchy of the time. And of course, what Shonibara is doing here is he's kind of shifting the register. He's using Dutch oilcloths, which are widely sold and used in African contexts contemporaneously. And you don't need me to go through how that deconstructs the particular representation of people and land and power and authority that's lodged with the Gainsborough painting. Next slide, please. And it goes on. It's a constant. The Santiago Sierra thing's quite interesting. It was a proposal of a Union flag soaked in the blood of Indigenous or First Nations people, was proposed for exhibition or display at the Museum of Old and New Art or one of the festivals associated with it in 2001. And as you can discern from the slide, there was a significant backlash about this. So this assumption that these almost standard tropes of critical contemporary art and its antecedents, that they are just kind of automatically acceptable is of course not the case. They can be very abstract in a generalizing conceptual way, which aren't necessarily acceptable to localized mores. Next slide, please. Here we are, we're into the territory of Chinese contemporary art. Here's I guess somebody everybody's familiar with, Yu Minjun, Liberty Leading the People, and then Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. It's an obvious pastiche, but it's interesting to think about what's left out of the Yue version of this, the flags, the guns, the diverse clothing, and also the kind of rictus-like smiles or grimaces, depending on which way you want to interpret them. And finally, next slide, please, thank you. We all know about what Ai Weiwei, dropping a Han Dynasty urn. Obviously, if you have a bit of knowledge about Chinese culture, it's not quite as iconoclastic as you might think. There are innumerable Han Dynasty urns, which are not necessarily that valuable. And also Zhang Peili becoming much better known internationally, and quite rightly so. Happiness is an appropriation video where Peili takes shots from communist era propaganda films and subjects them to repetition so that they lose their meaning. Happiness is transformed into something other than itself. So the reason for me showing these is just to show that there's a kind of standard genealogy of uses of defamiliarization techniques, of which we are quite familiar in relation to contemporary art, but that these have proliferated internationally. They've become a kind of transcultural lingua franca. The question I think we want to address today is whether this is just a straightforward extension of the kind of things that Picasso and Duchamp and neo-avant-garde artists of the 50s were doing in Euro-American context, whether that's just a simple repetition within other cultural contexts, in particular Chinese cultural contexts, or whether we're dealing with something else, whether there's a kind of a refraction or a diffraction of meaning and technique. And to help us do that, thanks, you can put the slides down now, Nick. To help us do that, we've got two wonderful people that I've known for quite a long time now. Now, you're not in Berlin at the moment. That's right. You're usually based in Berlin, but in Santiago, is that right? Drew?
We travel to Valencia.
Oh, Valencia. Well, you're usually based in Berlin, which is where I've met you before. And I'm going to ask Drew to kick off, just to give us a kind of an introduction to what Jia's going to say about her own work, and perhaps its relationship or non-relationship with questions of defamiliarization. Over to you, Drew.
I would argue that there are several moments in Chinese history where there's a very strong defamiliarization related to language. One occurs very early with the first unifying emperor of China, of Qin, who was the first emperor of Qin, Qin Shi Huang, and Qin is 213 to 210 BC before it's overcome by Han. And Qin was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, follows this warring states period, which we associate with Confucius's time in the 5th century BC, where there was no unified country and where warfare almost became a conceptual necessity, because it was understood that only one man could have, and it had to be a man in those days, could have the mandate of heaven. And therefore, if there are others competing for it, then de facto, the other one who declared that he had it could not have it, because there could not be many. And Qin Shi Huang responded to this by overthrowing the rest of them. And this became, in some people's mind, a proof that he indeed had the mandate of heaven, which gave him the right to be the emperor, to be acknowledged by everyone. And one of his signal characteristics was to embrace not Confucianism, which had already been established by that time as something of an orthodoxy for a couple of hundred years, but the ideology of another Chinese thinker, Han Feizi, who was a very, very strict legalist. He did not believe in the Confucian idea that human nature was fundamentally good. And his attitude was that the only way to overcome this intrinsically evil human nature of man was through legalism, to establish a very, very draconian legal system. And one of the ways this became first applied was in this policy for which Qin Shi Huang was maybe the most famous, which is that of Feng Shu Kangru. It means burn books, bury scholars. And by scholars, he uses the word Ru, which is Confucian scholars. And that, in effect, was a defamiliarization, because it was Confucian scholars, really, or the tradition of Confucian scholarship, that in a sense defined the very language of discourse. And therefore, this book burning and scholar burying was an imposed defamiliarization with an entire tradition that already had lasted for centuries in China. And this was 1,000 years before Zhu Xi in Song times establishes and standardizes the canon of classics, the 4 books and 5 classics, which ultimately became the basis for another 1,000 years of almost of the Chinese imperial examination system. I would argue that there's yet another moment of defamiliarization through language, which becomes very important, starting in 1917 with a famous essay by Hu Shi, the scholar who had studied at Columbia with John Dewey, and later became ambassador Chinese ambassador to the United States. And Husserl was the first to call for a vernacular literary style. And of course, in the essay calling for this, necessarily he wrote it in classical Chinese. But for so many centuries, classical Chinese was embedded in every aspect of formal or official discourse. And it remained that way in the Qing court until its end in 1911. And of course, classical Chinese is extremely difficult for anyone, including any Chinese person, to master as a written language. Part of the reason for it is that almost all words in classical Chinese are sort of in grammatical flux. The same words, the same characters without modification can serve as nouns, verbs, and even sometimes adjectives. And traditionally it was written without punctuation, and clues to its grammatical functions were because of the way it was written in parallelisms and in conjunction with certain particles that could give you a hint about the grammatical function of a given word following it or even preceding it. And a lot of times the virtuosity of classical Chinese precisely was in exploiting the ambiguity of the grammatical functions inherent in Chinese characters, the way classical Chinese used them. So Husserl therefore believed that the only way for China to become something like a modern country in his view, whatever that means, modern, was to adopt a vernacular style which closely resembled a written version of the way people actually spoke. It was written colloquial Chinese. And it took many decades for that idea gradually to evolve in literature. So if you look at the first decades of following Husserl in the 20s, 30s, and even 40s, you have a number of writers of fiction and also more scholarly writers of the history of ideas and of history itself who begin to develop this style. And so they would integrate certain colloquial elements into it while at the same time preserving many classical elements for the sake of economy, because classical Chinese is so much more economical in its expression. In fact, there are even very meager traces of it that you find that are become conventions of current text messaging. And the reason is simply because you can use them to make the message much shorter. And by so doing, you can make your text a little faster because you have fewer characters to add. So this transition to vernacular Chinese, which was made much more extreme by 1949, and which almost eliminated all classical Chinese expressions, no matter how they contributed to the economy of the utterance. Of course, in 55, 57, you get the Chinese character simplification program, which shortened the number of strokes in characters. And in so doing, this, I think, contributed a lot to the destruction of the formal aspect of Chinese characters, which had been so important in the Chinese character as an art form in Chinese calligraphy and the whole tradition of Chinese calligraphy that grew up over so many centuries. Of course, in Chinese calligraphy, there's also certain other departures from formal considerations. It does tend to be rather flat, except in one aspect, which is that calligraphers very often would vary the size of characters. So once the size was varied in the same line, you would get a sort of push-pull effect, which of course is one contribution to its formal aspect. But Chinese characters intrinsically had a formal aspect because they began as bone inscriptions for divinations, and therefore they looked like the very things that they signified. So a character that represented the moon, it looked like a very simple line drawing of the moon. And there are many, many other examples. And even when these characters became more, so to speak, conceptual by trying to render rather conceptual words, like a conjunction, for example, well, they still relied on certain pictographic elements which were related to phonetics that we think of as completely segregated from the Chinese character. For example, there's a very common word which is still used today, which is one way of saying and. And this character is rooted in the pictogram for a character that was hardly ever used, because it was a pictogram for the beard of a goat. But how did this become and? Well, at that time, this character for the beard of a goat, which almost was never used, except in very odd contexts, it had the same pronunciation, the same sound as the word for this rather abstract idea or conceptual idea of a conjunction. And therefore, they just appropriated it, as they did with many other characters. So they retained a pictographic or visual root that was eventually superseded by the new association, the new meaning, which in turn yielded other variations that had to do with the nature of classical Chinese itself, which we talked about before, namely the flux of grammatical function. So we had the first happened in Qin times. Later on, we had the development of the transformation of pictograms to represent sound associations for other meanings. And then in 1917, we get Husher and the appeal for vernacular Chinese and its gradual development, both in fiction and nonfiction, through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And then finally, we get a much more radical vernacularization, if you will, of Chinese that comes with the revolution. And this finally yields in 1955 to 1957 this character simplification that strips the characters entirely of their visual dimension. And certainly from my point of view, what jazz work does is to reinvest the Chinese character with its visual aspect by arranging them entirely according to formal criteria and not according to semantic criteria. So in these works, a person who's literate, probably in contemporary colloquial Chinese, and also occasionally, if they're literate in earlier forms of Chinese, they could read each individual character if they're lucky. Some of these have been lost entirely through disuse or other reasons that tend to be a little bit more ideological. And so if you have quite a memory for the old characters, many of which are now lost, you could, as a Chinese person, read individual characters. But there's no possibility in these works that they could operate as syntagms in an intelligible utterance, because they are arranged entirely according to formal criteria, so as to reinvest them with a formal aspect that, in effect, in a way, was taken away for ideological reasons. There are many who claim that these measures were taken to increase literacy, and this was even a justification of Hu Shi's for his language reform. But in fact, to give you one example, Taiwan is a place that continues to use traditional characters, and its literacy rate is higher than that of Switzerland. So I don't believe that it is credible to say that these kinds of visual reforms of Chinese characters are necessary to improve literacy. In addition, you could argue that for centuries, Chinese used a running style or what they call a grass style, which was a very cursive form to write characters, which enabled you to render them very, very quickly. And when I was a kid, I would go to Chinese restaurants in Chinatown in New York, and I noticed that the waiters, who often were not very highly educated people, either in their own tradition or in the Western tradition, but they had absolutely no problem in writing these characters very, very quickly in a highly cursive form. So those are the defamiliarizations related to language that I think of until we finally reach those of the Chinese version in Jia's work.
Just thank you very much, Drew. That's exactly, I think, what we need to know. Just before we move on to give the floor to Jia, maybe it's worth stressing that this historical desire to in some way unify the Chinese language responds to the vastness of China. That even today, China is a space of innumerable vernaculars and dialects, many of which have no written equivalent. That there's a shift from the dialect to the use of a kind of standard Mandarin script, a kind of transliteration.
I was astonished when I went to Guangzhou, which used to be called Canton.
Yes.
And therefore was you could say, the seat of the Cantonese dialect, which is maybe after Mandarin, the second most widely spoken dialect in China, and certainly the most widely spoken in the Chinese diaspora throughout the world. And when I went to Guangzhou, at a certain moment, I found a sort of very improvised market where farmers would come down the hills from their villages to sell their produce, mostly vegetables, in the city. And to do this, they would spread out blankets on the sidewalk and spread their vegetables on the blanket. And I thought, if anyone would speak Cantonese dialect, these would be the ones. And I discovered they all spoke almost perfect Mandarin. And it was a disappointment to me when I spoke to them in Mandarin, and they replied to me in a way that indicated not only had they understood perfectly what I was saying, but they even seemed to communicate among themselves in Mandarin, as though it was really their first language.
Sorry, Jia, please go ahead.
When you talk about China, because as a Chinese and having been living here in Germany for over 12 years, and it has been many times, and all the Western people ask me about China. And of course, I know a little bit more probably than you do, but I have to say that I'm always willing to go back to China to find out more, because I realize more and more, I realize how little I know about China. Because when you're talking about, as a majority, I have to say that, I'm also a Han people, not from the minority. And of course, with the work I'm going to talk about focus on the Chinese language, which I know, but all those minorities, they have their own culture, their own languages, and their own art, which you can say that is kind of like defamiliarization for the majority, even for the Chinese. But on the other hand, that's the richness of the Chinese culture, and that's the richness of the all, the culture in the world. But we know so little about them, and they haven't been defeated all the time. And so we have to it's something like, I think when you talk about defamiliarization, it's really a relative word for which criteria that we're talking about, and compared to the other cultures, the minority cultures and the majority culture. For example, I'm only talking about Chinese culture, but it's the same in every culture. I think the majority are quite I shouldn't say quite boring, but compared to them, I'm very limited, I have to say. So my work is it's about the language I know. So that's the only thing I could start it with, but there's still a lot that I hope one day we all can have chance to even have opportunity to see them.
But if I remember, you lived among the Miao people, right? Or the E minority.
Yeah, E minority, yeah.
I think this is a crucial thing for us just to remember, is that China is not this monolith, even though there's the claim of a 90+% dominant Han society, which is questionable in itself as to whether that's a given, ontologically given identity. China is made up of multiple ethnic identities, multiple.
For example,
Please.
For example, I visited south of China, Fujian. It was just opposite of Taiwan, that area. That's and when you visit, because every local city, they have their own museums. So of course you would love to visit museum to find out the history, the local history. But all the local history only started when the Han people invaded. And they would never say invaded, of course, and they said that
special operation.
Yes, and then but even you see the people, they look so different from Han people, and they're all mixed.
Denazification.
Yeah. Just before we move on to give you the floor, Jia. When I lived in Ningbo, which is not too far away from Hangzhou and Shanghai, I had a driver, and on weekends, this guy very kindly would take us out to places surrounding Ningbo. So we would go and visit temples. There's this kind of quite old, in some cases, Buddhist temples outside of Ningbo. And we drove one weekend, maybe 5-7 miles outside of Ningbo. We got out of the car, it's a sweltering day, and the son, our driver, gets out, leans up against the car, lights a cigarette, and a guy rides past on a bicycle and stops and starts speaking to him for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then the guy on the bike heads off. So I go up to son and said, I didn't, that sounded like dialect. What did the guy say? And son said, I have absolutely no idea. And this son is somebody who was conversant in, like a lot of people, just general people, conversant in his local dialect, his Ningbo Wenzhou dialect, and also Mandarin Chinese, standard Mandarin Chinese. And yet 5 miles away, he couldn't understand what was being said to him.
Yeah, we were in the Chinese restaurant a few days ago in Valencia, and Drew was asking me what kind of dialect they're talking about. I said probably the Wenzhou dialect, because I couldn't understand the word. And during there was a short period that China had war with Vietnam, so I heard they used lots of soldiers from Wenzhou and let them deliver information because the Vietnamese couldn't translate. Yeah, because it's so different from Mandarin, and it's so different from all other areas in the south of China. And so if you try to find out how could that language be created, in the history and what the real history of the local people. It would be very interesting.
Yeah. Right, we need to move on, but maybe Drew will come back to this Confucian idea of rectification of terms if we have time. But for now, Jia, over to you. Please tell us how some or all of this relates to your work, and in particular the Chinese version series.
Thank you. And Nick, please start it. Thank you. I only show a few pieces of my work. They're all from the version called the Chinese version. Obviously, they made of the Chinese characters, but I mix with simplification Chinese characters and abandoned Chinese characters, because I was very interested in the traditional Chinese culture. So I still have a dictionary that's including more than 100,000 Chinese characters. Of course, with the modern Chinese language dictionary, you only use a little bit over 10,000 Chinese characters. Of course, with the characters, 2 or 3 characters, or 4 characters, you make up Chinese words. So it's still a lot, but not many people know that there were so many Chinese characters exist. And even in the dictionary, most of the characters, they only show that the character did exist in the history, but they couldn't find out the meaning, and they couldn't find out the pronunciation either. So for me, I took up the meaning of the characters, and I put them in a formula way. So you more or less, from this piece, you more or less can see there was kind of like a lines or waves in between the characters, which does not really exist. It's just the way that I try to manage to take up the meaning of the characters and give them, because the Chinese character also has image signs. So I try to give them another image above their image sign. So that's, I think, with our topic, today's topic, the defamiliarization. So it's a way like operate the syntagma or sequential units, as Drew mentioned, of the meaning. So, people they can read some of the characters, but they still, there's no meaning of it. So I hope that people stand in front of my work, no matter if you're Chinese or you're from other culture, to think about what way. I think it's not only happened in Chinese culture, it's happened everywhere. So to think about what we have been lost from our own culture, because in general, I think every modern culture only take more or less 7% from the traditional culture. So it's a very common topic. And I just used what I know from my own language and to explain the view and in front of everybody. And hopefully, this, at least we have chance to face that either you can say question or problem, and to think about what we can do with it.
Could I just, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but just for the benefit of viewers, if somebody is looking at this who's familiar with the Chinese language, the written language, and they're from mainland China, where the simplification of language took place in the 50s, if they're looking at this work, there are certain characters which will be unfamiliar to them. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, there are certain characters they don't know. They don't know what it is, but they look, of course, they look like Chinese characters, and they were Chinese characters. For example, like we all know that Xu Bing's work that he made up lots of characters by himself, but you know, but in fact, there are some of his character that he made up that was a real character or the real Chinese character.
That he didn't realize.
Yeah, he didn't know that.
That's the big irony of his work.
Because I totally understand with his education background, and it's very difficult to know that we did have that part of history that's especially like his generation was really difficult to find out. Yeah.
I think that's where defamiliarization shades into the kind of issues of cultural translation, which are very interesting. But just one more.
When John mentioned
the
difference in the number of characters defined in the old dictionary in comparison with the contemporary one, it reminded me that I'd forgotten to mention that in the course of simplification, not only was it a matter of the reduction in the number of strokes of characters, but also, in effect, there was an elimination of about at least a third of Chinese characters from the lexicon of that which was allowed to be published.
Fascinating. And I think what's interesting here, of course, is that the waves that you're depicting, in a sense, don't exist. They're simply an illusion of the way that you've organized the characters. And it says something about the regularity of the way that Chinese characters are constructed. It allows you to make these waves because the characters themselves are constructed in a regular way. So you have this kind of interesting play between absence and presence. The absence and presence of characters themselves, of their meanings or non-meanings, and also visually, this sense of something being present that isn't actually there. It's an interesting illusion that you create.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the next piece?
Yes, please do. Please do.
And this one is kind of like the form of resembles cubes, also suggests a perspective projection, because it's you know, it's not like the one single point perspective with vantage point and horizontal line, but it's more like the traditional Chinese Shanxue perspective, you know, with many multiple perspective points, and also you can have the feeling of the traditional Chinese calligraphy, because the calligraphy also have with the size difference, it also have this push and pull that how do you say that visualized effect, you know, and you can see like the characters are jumping out from the papers. So with this work, the more complicated character in the middle, or we can see that that's the characters that the Chinese all know. But there are also two other characters. Looks like you know, divided the middle characters to two parts, but they are also two different characters, and they were abandoned characters, so we don't use them anymore. So I make that so it's depart from the, I think with the defamiliarization, they depart from the flatness of the work. So that's probably not very familiar with the Western artwork. And also I think in January, because the Chinese art and the Chinese art history, calligraphy was always equal as a Chinese how should I say it? Chinese art, for example, like Shanxue, the mountains and the landscape art, or we can see the flowers and the birds and all other, but it's not familiar with in the Western art category, I have to say, in the major Western art category. But for us, and also once I mentioned to Paul that even in the music, when you listen to even to the pop music, of course, I was also talking about the traditional, like a Chinese opera, we focus more on the lyric than the text than the music itself, because people don't really care about the music itself, and they really care about the content. What is really says about that, because that's more like a poems, and very beautiful poems in the traditional Chinese opera. So here is just, I think the modern language, I have to say, really took off the most beautiful part of the Chinese language, not only the structure, the rhythm, and the content. So I think it's not an accident I make the Chinese version like that, because as an editor, I worked as an editor for a while, so I was really interested in the literature. I also studied the literature and history of traditional Chinese drama. So, and it was such a tragedy and so sad to see that the modern language and took off everything. It's almost nothing left. It's unbearable for me because of the COVID that I have to read the news every day. But it's really unbearable for me to read the news because the language we use today is really awful.
Please go on.
Yeah, so we can move on to the next piece. And this one is also all those pieces, the third piece, and the first three pieces are all untitled, but I have to say this one is only made by 2 Chinese characters. In the background, there's very tiny, small characters which you couldn't see clearly, but it's with a big character in the front, you could see the 2 parts are totally the same. So, and in the background, this one is called double happiness, because each one is a Chinese character happiness. So we put together and make them as a double happiness. So in the background, it's all made by happiness, or we can say single happiness, just to make the difference so a bit clear. And so double happiness is that's character only used for wedding, to wish the couple happy forever, because it's kind of like one happy person and now it's unique to another happy person, so they have the double happiness. I'm not expert on the other languages that has image sign, for example, probably in the ancient Greek or other language, they also have the similar structure of their characters or like their languages. But so far, I know that that's very unique in the Chinese language. And the way I represent it is very, because you have the tension, or we can say the 2 characteristic of surrealism, because it's a scale relation and also the position, because you can see the big characters are above the small characters, but in fact the big characters are made also by the small double happiness characters. So it's the small characters also above the big character. So here we can see it clearly, but if you see the real work is 2 meters by 2 meters. So when you stand in front of it, you really get lost and you couldn't see. It's really kind of like you don't know where you are, but once you step backwards, And little by little, you can see the double happiness start to appear in front of you until you really keep distance. You can see what we see now from the computer. So I think that's another way to show the kind of like we can say the defamiliarization of the language in front of the visitors, in front of the viewers, and also it's also the tradition that with the right color and to always wish people happy and lucky, and but in some way we can see I try to find my own way to continue this Chinese tradition.
It's a crucial idea, this one of resonance or reciprocity between signifiers and signifieds across the language, which gives rise to the kind of other subtle, nuanced, elusive meanings that both of you have been referencing. I mean, going back to the last image, the curves don't exist. They come out of this resonance between the characters. And I think, as an allusion to the complexity of unfolding meaning in Chinese language. Well, all languages have it, but it's especially embedded in Chinese and culture, it seems to me, where meanings themselves are in a constellation. They're not kind of separate or ever compartmentalized. They always kind of mutually resonate and support one another. Ja, please go on.
Thank you. May we show the last piece? Yes, this one is the one probably very few pieces have. The title is called 100 Women. And we can see this is 100 characters, and each one, the left part has a radical, means woman, or you can say women. And so I have to say that my grandma, my father's mother, she's a typical woman from countryside, from Chinese rural area. And also she devoted all her love to all her children and grandchildren, including me. But until she passed away, it's the first time I realized that she didn't have a name, and a given name like all other traditional Chinese women, and that's a Chinese tradition for many centuries. So those 100 women are the 100 Chinese women's name I found in my dictionary, and which was very hard to find, but I think I got that inspiration from my grandma, also from those names, because I think when we talk about history and we talk about the names and the events, but I think for me and all those unknown people who are the majorities, who are the people who really create the history, but which we don't know anything about them. And those characters, those 100 women's names also fell into disuse as those women pass away, and along with their identities, so effaced from the histories. We have no idea what happened to them and their stories. So I also made similar pieces like 100 fish, and with 100 distinct fish, and each Chinese extinct fish, and each Chinese character represent a kind of extinct fish. And also there's 100 birds, and each Chinese character represents an extinct bird. So I think this is, I have to say that this series most focus on the past, but I forgot who said that, what we learn from the history that we never learn from history. So, so that's part of the reason, of course, that it's also has some my personal reason that we always, I think especially my generation, when we talk about the past, we always thought the past was better, especially when we were poor, you know, when we should say that before, how do you say that, 改革开放?
Reform and opening up.
Yeah, before the reform and opening up, and we were really poor, but we never care about money, and we really shared everything with each other. And I talked to some people from the East Berlin. Of course, we all had some horrible times, but when we talk about that part, and we all agree that the past was better. So maybe that's part of the reason that I for quite a period, I always look the past, and I think I'm, on the other hand, I'm lucky that I found this part of the past that interests me and gave me lots of inspiration. So I would love to represent those parts to people, and hopefully that will give them some inspiration or some thoughts too. I think so.
Thank you very much. We're not out of time, but we're coming towards the end of our time. But I think just before we kind of move on, I've got this is the catalogue, or one of the books about Jie's work, and I've got a couple of quotes here from Jie herself, which I think illuminate what she's just been saying, which I think it would be quite useful. And of course, I've immediately lost my place. No, here we are. The first one, and it's really about the way that what's being brought together here, the kind of defamiliarizing shift, is the contemporary or form of the works, which of course, you know, very much fits into the kind of minimalist conceptual order or genre of work that we're familiar with across a kind of range of contemporary art, but also bringing into play these very specific issues to do with history and the history of culture in China. So the first quote is this, and I begin, this is from you, Jie. The Chinese version since 2011 is also deceptive in this way. Behind the outward form that recalls Western conceptual art of the 1960s is the tragedy, very important word there, is the tragedy of the missing and simplified Chinese characters, the loss of 5,000 years of my country's and my culture's history. In my view, a goal of conceptual art was to strip the formal aspect of a work in favor of the idea. My work reinvests a formal aspect that was stripped from Chinese characters by law. Anything you want to add to that? I think it sums up what you're doing there very well indeed.
Oh, I have to say I changed my mind. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, please do.
Because
I think that's part of the process.
After these years, I even question about this 5,000 years history, because I mean, yeah, in some ways, it's very how do you say that, nationalism, that's the way we created. And also I realized that in many ways that language changes and the movement of the language. For example, I have to say the simplification and of course the criticism of simplification, especially I do suffer a lot. I still suffer a lot, because that's a tragedy, especially not for, I mean, it's partly for my generation, but not the major tragedy of the generation is my parents' generation, because first they experienced the Cultural Revolution, they didn't get enough resource of the books they could read, and the second, that since their personalization was formed, and they couldn't change themselves anymore, so it's they were too late. But my generation was a bit better, because there were lots of young people. They they went back to the traditional culture by themselves, and they did, and we do with, I mean, compared to the Cultural Revolution, I have to say we're much open. We did get much more resources, but you know, language changed, everything changes. So we cannot stop it, but how we get involved, that's more important, I think. Yeah.
And just finally, thank you very much. I think it's important because we can't regard any of this as static. I think the processes of familiarization, defamiliarization through all language just roll on anyway. There's very little that we can do to stop it. I think what the Chinese version does is to point towards the necessity of recognizing the openness of language to meaning, that you can't suppress meaning. But I've got a final quote here from you, which you may or may not agree with again. But and here's the quote: "I also think the abstract," and this is wheeling back onto the earlier panels that we had about abstraction, but "I also think the abstract strategy of much of my work comes partially from traditional Chinese literature, especially poems and lyrics, wherein the aim was to express as much as possible with the greatest economy of language. Abstract traditional Chinese ink painting influenced me too, and the way of thinking about lines and spaces from my architectural training are also present for me, or always present for me. Besides that, the repression of individualism by the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, that brainwashed my grandparents and successfully the generation of my parents still impacts strongly on me. The tension between the surface and what is beneath struggling to emerge." Any thoughts on that quote?
I think that part has to remain, because I think when we talk about abstracts, that's you know, as I said before, I was very interested in the literature and traditional Chinese opera, and I think language itself is very abstract, you know, compared to visual art. I have to say that. So what it can bring us, especially from the Chinese calligraphy and from the literature, and for me, it's much more. So I reduce everything. I only use a black and white, because it's partly it's also because I use the font was invented by the Japanese when the first printing machine imported to Japan, that they start to print in the Chinese character with the Japanese languages. So I use exactly the font, but on the other hand, you know, the richness is not you can won't be simplified just by the color or by the black and white. On the other hand, with the traditional Chinese shanxue or Chinese landscape paintings, and we always have that tradition, we call it liu bai, so you keep some white space. And so you can see that there might be much white space in my piece, and which give you some, we say, give you some space to breathe, or give you some space to live as sky, or as some, create some more space inside of you know, on the canvas, and so on the other hand, sorry, what did I say the last? Paul?
Well, it was about Shisha, really, this kind of idea of absence and presence of form, and the resonance between the absence and the presence kind of gives rise to a kind of third meaning or
and
other
also
meaning.
Yes, I mentioned my training of my architecture design study. Of course, you could also have some idea that we all trained the first year. We trained exactly like Bauhaus students, because we like to keep that. I don't know why, but the Chinese still a lot of Chinese architecture school, they like to keep that. So it gave me lots of impact, I have to say, that's everything, I think. And also, as I mentioned before, that my family stories, that which my generation and my parents' generation, and including my grandparents' generation, all these 3 generations so far, all the story and new, and everything, I think, together and create this series.
Well, thank you very much. We could talk about this endlessly, I think. Perhaps there's a kind of version 2 of this panel. But I think we need to move on to some audience questions. I think, Nick, we've got some questions that we might want to put to Jia and Drew.
Yes, well, I want to thank you all for such a wonderful conversation and for joining us this evening from around the world. First, I'm going to pass the mic to our friend G.E. Schwartz.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for this panel. I love the evening, and how it's wrapping here. Is the symbolic power exclusively found not in what we see, but more in what we don't? And is it kind of not about what is shown, but more about what is not shown?
Drew, Jia?
Thank you for joining us. Yes, I agree with you. It's more about what is not shown and what is behind and what is in common in every culture.
I think there are certainly these underlying principles in classical Chinese culture where the interplay of what is shown and not shown.
Yes, and that's also the most elegant part of the traditional Chinese poem. You never say it clearly, and there was always much more behind. Yeah.
I mean, that's why Chinese poems in translation, say into English, seem very bold, almost bland.
Or stilted.
But it misses the point, doesn't it, within the Chinese language, that it's this play between absence and presence, allusions and knowledge of history, knowledge of the classics that come to bear, memory that comes to bear on the meanings that are signified.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, GE. Thank you, everyone. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Kathy. You should be able to turn on your mic now.
I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I think you chose to use font throughout. So I wanted to know more about why you choose the Japanese font, not a Chinese one, and why you have the mechanical reproduction instead of ever the touch of a hand.
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
Because the Japanese language use lots of Chinese characters. On one hand, the second hand, it's
right from
yes, it's the Japanese. They first import the printing machine, so not the Chinese. So they invented this font first to print the Chinese character in this way. So the Chinese character was first showed in this way, in a printing way, in this font.
You mean in types in movable type?
In modern settings.
I mean, technically that's not true.
No, it's not in movable type. It's a printing machine. It's because in traditional Chinese way we print by hand. That it's not like how do you say that? Not by the electricity machine. It's just by the machine we move like a wood and you print with your hands.
Right, woodblock.
Yeah, woodblock. Yes, and so my work, why I use that, because I think it's create a tension, because I still paint it by myself by hand.
Right.
It creates a tension between the machine made and the handwriting and the calligraphy. It's not calligraphy anymore. I cannot.
It's not xylography. I mean, calligraphy.
Yeah, calligraphy. It's not calligraphy anymore, but still, I did. You can say that I did paint it, or so that's I think that's the tension and also the, I shouldn't say the struggling, inside of me.
So you,
with the loss of the language, it's also the struggling of the modern language, the loss from the tradition. Because we are all after the industry revolution, we all have to face that problem. Yeah.
so in some ways you're reclaiming form from mechanized form. Is that what you're saying? You're sort of looking for patterns inside of mechanically reproduced shapes. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because in some ways your things remind me of Kurt Schwitter's collages with words, but there's something, you're working with bianpang, you're working with radicals like woman or fish, and those are kind of random groupings where you could almost make pictures from them if you, you're restricting your resources in some way. People have, yeah. I mean, you're restricting your resources and the kind of patterns you can make in order to go in what direction,
Yeah, if you say that, yeah, I agree with you from that point of view, yes.
Then if you look in the 16th century, there were people who did catalogs just of fish, all the different species of fish that could be found in a region and then beyond, and you're making it just a visual collection of the fish radical and species of fish. It kind of doesn't read, right? Anyway, I'll come back. Sorry?
The fact of their extinction sort of.
Oh, they're all extinct species.
Yeah, they're all extinct.
And all unnamed women. So they're kind of.
No, they're all women's names because.
Most women are mom or grandma or auntie or.
I don't know because they just.
I mean, most.
Yeah, you can say, but all women are grandmas or auntie. But in my dictionary it says it's a woman's name, but.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'll come back. Thank you. I want to hear more about how you're thinking about defamiliarization. I mean, each piece is unique in a way. The no and half no's are
infinitely reproducible as well.
Yeah, sorry?
Infinitely reproducible as well. I think you've raised some very interesting subtle points there about kind of shifts and what we do or don't know about, say, the history of printing in China. And I think what Jaz's referring to is mechanical reproduction and the way that Chinese characters are first mechanically reproduced by the Japanese, and then that shifts back into China. But of course, that has some significance when we look at the work.
I mean, there's mechanical reproduction in the 8th century, so.
Yeah, but not in terms of
industrial level.
Not in terms of industrial
right,
mechanical reproduction, not in the Benjaminian sense. And I think actually those important points to raise, because looking at the work in those subtle terms has a significant impact on the way we understand the work and its cultural and social and economic context.
And also that font, believe it or not, it was most used during the Cultural Revolution, and especially, and sometimes they still use today for lots of propaganda you can see on the street or on the meetings. So it's, I have to say, strongly impact, especially in my childhood, that I know that we were all bounded by that, which in some way I hated, but I try to, you can see that it's really struggling. But I don't think we can really get rid of it, especially, at the moment, I don't think so.
It also speaks to the kind of leakiness of Chinese culture, that the Chinese notion of empire, of course, is a border which has no kind of fixed limits, that's open and closed. It has a resonance with these ideas of absence and presence as well. So we can just as much think of a kind of radiating East Asian and even Southeast Asian culture which relates to some of these ideas. Hence this kind of very interesting point about the mechanical means of reproduction in the modern sense, as opposed to this long history of printmaking, which I think has some real bearing on what you're doing. Anyway, perhaps we should move on to another question, but thanks for that. I thought that was fantastic questions to ask.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. So I'm going to read on the audience members' behalf the final question. Gabriel in the audience asked, I wonder whether you would be able to talk on Brecht's inspiration of distantiation or estrangement and how defamiliarization influenced it. So
perhaps that's one for me, right? I mean, I think Brecht's idea of estrangement is part of this open lexicon of, for want of a better catch-all term, defamiliarizing methods. In Brecht's terms, it was a way of estranging people from their ordinary everyday situation to expose underlying kind of social relationships and relationships of production in a kind of revolutionary dialectical way. So a simple answer to the question would be, it's another variation on a technical and conceptual, or discursive and technical approach, which has been consistent, certainly as part of modernist, postmodernist, contemporary art. But actually, as we were kind of touching on in the last question, these things aren't kind of fixed. There's no kind of threshold at the end of the 19th century and the mid-19th century where these things come in. One way of looking at this is that this is a constant in language, that these processes of dislocation and shift, and if you want to start using kind of deconstructive language, the kind of deconstruction or difference, it's a historical constant, but it's one which very much comes to the fore, I think, and that's what I think Brecht is doing. He's doing it in a dialectical Marxian sense, but it's a species of defamiliarization which comes to the fore as part of modern culture. And we talked the last time in the last panel about the relationship to Heidegger's idea that modernism or modern art starts, in a sense, with the uncanny, with the unheimlich, with defamiliarization. I think my point would be there isn't just one way of doing that, and there isn't necessarily one way of interpreting how that works. And I think what we've been hearing this evening collectively is how what we might call defamiliarization operates in relation to contemporary Chinese art, but actually it also operates in relation to classical and historical Chinese culture, but in ways that we might be partly familiar with or not so familiar.
Thank you, Paul.
Drew, put your mic on.
Yes, please.
You have to
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, you brought up at the outset the idea of periodization. And this becomes an extremely important and controversial issue in Asian historiography, mainly because many people think the great Chinese historian of China of the 20th century was Qian Mu. But other people think that it was a Japanese historian of China who was Naito Tetsushiro. And Naito's whole great contribution to the study of Chinese history was a completely new periodization of it. He reperiodized everything. And he said that the old periodization, which really derived from the dynastic histories, and which was sort of conditioned by the idea that, well, the dynasty loser had to be evil because otherwise he would not have lost the mandate of heaven. And the new founder of the dynasty had to be good. Otherwise he would not have come to possess the mandate of heaven. And this determined a lot of the periodization. But Naito had his own criteria, and this was perhaps one of the greatest contributions of the 20th century to the study of Chinese history. So there are sort of layers and layers of defamiliarization folding in on each other because of the matter of periodization and the interpretation of periodization from a moral standpoint.
Any more, Nick? Thanks, Drew.
No, I think that I Firstly, I want to thank you all so much, and thank you everyone for joining and for all of your questions. I think this is a good moment for us to go to our other tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. So I'm very pleased to welcome today our poet laureate Jennifer S. Cheng to the stage. Jennifer S. Cheng's work includes poetry, lyric essay, and image text forms exploring immigrant home building, shadow poetics, and the feminine monstrous. She's the author of Moon, Letters, Maps, Poems, named a Publisher's Weekly Best Book of 2018, and House A, selected by Claudia Rankine for the Omnidon Poetry Prize. Having grown up in Texas and Hong Kong, she currently lives in San Francisco. And Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks for having me. I just wanted to say that I found the conversation so interesting, and I do hope that these poems will somehow converse. Poetry's goal is to defamiliarize the familiar, to tell its slant in order to more effectively say what cannot be said. So I think it's been a really enriching conversation for me. So I'm going to read a few poems from my book, House A, which is about the tones and textures of Chinese American immigrant home building and kind of the porousness of history and home. And these are from a series in the book of epistolary poems. So they're all addressed to Mao Zedong. Dear Mao, I want to describe for you the feeling of sleep as described by neuropsychologist Julia Tononi, who uses words like oscillations and waves, while his patient is noted to gather the phrase, the sea moving a boat. Elsewhere are words like sleepwalking and daydreaming, so I can only conclude that sleep is a boundary whose line is slowly eroding. Sleep, like childhood, is more of a sense than an experience we can articulate from beginning to end. As a child in Texas, bathed in sun, I often fell asleep in the car, even in daytime, and my father would carry me into the house with my head pressed against his shoulder. If my mother, who was much smaller, was the driver, she would crack open a window on warm afternoons, and I would later wake to the pleasure of utter silence and aloneness, the sun across my face. I want to emphasize to you that both responses were acts of love, and if by chance an airplane overhead excavated an echo in the sky, then I knew that I was cradled in its sound. Inside our home of secret languages, my mother boiled up a pot of salty rice porridge, and my father watched our neighbors like a devout mockingbird, straw doormats, pine wreaths in the winter. So I want you to know that if sleep is an ocean, then it is because we are migrants inwardly sighing along to its many oscillations, unintimidated by factual distances, but awash in the knowledge of three: body, bodying, embodied. And if water is a metaphor, then it is because water fills up a room, slow-moving, blurry, immersive, but obscured. Strangely enough, it was not my father, but my mother who gave us history lessons steeped in a pale, languorous liquid. We sleep where our home is, and we build a home where we sleep. Dear Mao, I want to describe for you the migration pattern of birds, which has nothing to do with sleep, but which I nonetheless find beautiful. When insects sleep, they are awakened only by poetic forces, like the heat of the sun or the darkness of night. The most beautiful of flying insects huddle together in sleep, but little is known about the slumbering habits of migratory birds. Birds, as far as I know, do not fear being shot down from the sky, though fear is a common warning sign for flight. Some birds, feeling their bones weighed down by air, migrate not by sky, but by swimming, their wings waving down the sea as if buoyed by its girth. Other birds are wanderers, their migratory curvatures charted like flowering seeds across the globe. Here on the earth where bones are buried, the question remains: if the birds of history alight by a ritual of body and landscape, do they make the return out of longing, out of heartache? For it is the anthropologist who traces the longing for home between personal biography and the biography of the collective, a map that ends beyond locatable distances into mythical terrains, imaginary homelands. We do this, listen to the body, gauge its violence, take flight. Dear Mao, when my mother first told me the folktale of the woman in the moon, I thought it was a story of the evils of man. You'll remember how the archer aimed upward and shot down the 9 suns, saving the earth from scorching heat. But then out of conceit and possibly psychosis, he wanted to shoot the final 10th sun just so he could watch his fire bleed across the sky. In school, we learned the mythology of Zeus, and all I could think was, what kind of people imagine for themselves a god who punishes the innocent and ravages women? Narrative, as we know, is an essential marker in child development. A child achieves story grammar around the same age that she learns to recognize her body as her own. Before that, people are an interconnected sea. We all long for narrative. Mine begins with water or sleep or the feeling of my parents moving about the house on summer afternoons. In the summers, they would open the windows of our Texas house and let in the smell of warm grass. And as I wandered into the kitchen where Shanghainese opera frolicked through the static of our old radio, I often heard rather than saw my mother walking around barefoot, mixing sticky ground meat with scallions and cooking wine. This can be a kind of narrative. Scents of backyard plants, the acoustics of kitchen linoleum, cold rito tang to follow up our lunches. What if I were to name my children after heroic figures of ancient Greece? Theseus, Achilles, Hector. Dear Mao, I hope you understand that what I am doing is trying to give you a history of water, which, like memory and sleep, is fluid and wafting in refracted light. History as water, so that I am giving you something that spreads. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Jennifer. That was a beautiful and very fitting way to close today's event. Thank you once more, of course, Gia, Drew, Paul. Thank you everyone for tuning in and for your questions. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we will upload today's conversation shortly. Please join us tomorrow at our regular 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with artist Nate Lohman and Braille contributor Andrew Woolbright. We will conclude with a poetry reading by Heidi Van Horn. You can now all say, turn on your microphones and say hello, goodbye, good morning, and good night. And thanks for tuning in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that
Thank you.
incredible reading.
Can we just, before we all go, Nick,
Yes.
just draw everybody's attention to the next in this particular
Please.
series,
Please.
which is on the first Monday of, or the last Monday of April. And it will be realisms in Chinese visual cultures and abstractions. So if you've seen this one and the one before it on abstractions, you'll get the full set if you join us live for that one, but you can always see them, as Nick says, in their recorded form.
Absolutely.
Nick, it was very generous of you to be so thoughtful in the way you've treated this.
It's all thanks goes to you, Drew, Gia, and Paul. Paul is the one behind it all, so I can't take much of
No,
the
it's a collective effort. I'm an old school internationalist socialist, so you know, nobody can take credit.
Well, sending you all solidarity, and Drew and Gia, thank you for tuning in so late where you are. So I wish you both a very good night.
It's such an honor that we spend this 1.5 hour together.
Yes.
From different part of the world. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a
Yeah,
very
it's all
unique
good.
1.5 hour in our lives. Yeah.
Well, it's so reassuring that the goals of international socialism take precedence over the sovereignty of any individual nation.
Absolutely.
Precisely.
Except when it comes to defending yourself against people who invade you, of course.
Special operation.
Yes, special operation.
Right. Well, we'll have a good evening and a good morning, and we'll all see you next time.
Thanks again to all of you.
Thanks, guys, everyone.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Take care. Be well.
Stay safe.
Ciao.